Sydney underworld figure Shayne Hatfield has died in prison. A spokesperson says he was found in his cell in Parklea Jail on Friday.
If you've ever heard his name, chances are you know it's tied to one of the biggest drug empires Australia has ever seen. For years, Shayne Hatfield operated under the radar, pulling the strings of a multi-million-dollar network of smuggling and trafficking. Known as the #1 drug lord in Australia, Hatfield built a criminal empire that stretched far beyond the country's borders. He had eyes everywhere, informants in every corner, and a reputation that scared even the most hardened criminals. But who is Shayne Hatfield? What turned him from an unknown figure into the kingpin of Australia's drug trade? In this script, we'll take a deep dive into his life, his rise to power, the methods he used to stay at the top, and ultimately, how the law came close to catching up with him. We'll also explore the lasting impact of his empire on Australia, and what it means for the future of crime in the country. Shayne Hatfield wasn't always a criminal mastermind. Born in the mid-1970s, Hatfield grew up in Sydney, Australia. He had a fairly normal upbringing, nothing that would suggest he was destined for a life in crime. But as he reached his teenage years, things began to shift. Sydney, in the 1990s, was a city where crime and drugs were becoming increasingly prevalent. Like many young people at the time, Hatfield was drawn to the idea of quick money and the allure of the underground world. It was in his early 20s that Hatfield began dabbling in the drug trade. At first, it was small time, maybe dealing a little here and there. But Hatfield had an eye for opportunity. He saw the massive demand for drugs in Australia, particularly methamphetamine, a substance that was rapidly growing in popularity. It wasn't long before he realized the potential for something much bigger. His entry into the world of organized crime came at a time when Australia's drug market was booming. There were plenty of small-time dealers, but few had the vision and ambition to control the supply on a national scale. Hatfield quickly saw this gap in the market. By his mid-20s, he had begun to make connections with other criminals and started building his network. What was once a small operation soon became a far-reaching network, connecting Australia to the global drug trade. Hatfield was smart. He understood the importance of keeping a low profile while working with others to expand his operation. He wasn't the type to rely on a single method of smuggling or distribution. He diversified. He made sure that even if one part of his network was compromised, he had others in place to keep the flow of drugs coming into Australia. Shayne Hatfield's rise to the top wasn't an accident. His ability to build a criminal empire was due to his keen strategic mind and his willingness to take risks. While other criminals might have relied on violence to secure their positions, Hatfield focused on building relationships. He surrounded himself with loyal associates, some of whom were willing to put everything on the line for him. One of the key elements to Hatfield's empire was his involvement in the methamphetamine trade. At the time, meth was becoming one of the most sought-after drugs in Australia, and Hatfield saw it as the perfect opportunity. He used his growing network to source large quantities of meth from international suppliers. These suppliers weren't just local dealers. They were connected to cartels and distributors worldwide. Hatfield's ability to tap into these international networks made him a key player in the global drug trade. But Hatfield didn't just import drugs. He was involved in every part of the operation. From the moment the drugs arrived on Australian soil, he had people in place to ensure they made it to their final destinations. His empire had a complex system of distribution that reached from the major cities like Sydney and Melbourne to the farthest corners of the country. He used a combination of smuggling routes, hidden inside shipping containers, concealed within legitimate imports, and even using local distribution networks to ensure that the drugs kept flowing. As the years went by, Hatfield's operation grew. He had access to not just meth, but also ecstasy, cocaine, and other illegal substances. Each drug had its own market, and Hatfield was savvy enough to ensure he could corner as many of them as possible. He wasn't just making a profit, he was establishing a monopoly on the drug trade in Australia. The fact that Shayne Hatfield was able to conceal his business dealings was one of the factors that contributed to the incredible success of his empire. Because he was aware of the potential consequences of being caught, he took precautions to avoid being discovered. Hatfield placed a significant amount of reliance on the utilization of smuggling networks, which were continuously developing in order to keep one step ahead of the authorities. Despite the fact that Australia is an island nation, its ports are among the most important entrance points for goods. In order to smuggle drugs into the country, Hatfield took advantage of this system. by exploiting legitimate shipments. There was no better way to conceal the illegal narcotics that he was bringing into the country than by concealing them in containers that were filled with commonplace objects. Because the drugs were frequently concealed in plain sight, it was difficult for police officials to find them hiding in plain sight. In addition to this, Hatfield collaborated with a network of corrupt officials, not just within the Customs and Border Control agencies, but also in other areas of the economy. It was because to these folks that his supplies were able to pass through without being discovered. In the realm of organized crime, bribing officials was not a novel practice, yet Hatfield's utilization of this strategy enabled him to carry out his operations with a reasonable degree of ease for a considerable amount of time. In addition to smuggling, Hatfield established distribution networks that made certain that the drugs were able to make their way onto the streets. Additionally, he had people in rural areas and small towns who served as intermediaries, so his power extended beyond the major urban centers. After that, these distributors would sell the narcotics to local dealers, who would then distribute them to those who were using them. Regardless of how far away the transaction was taking place, Hatfield was able to keep control of his empire thanks to the extensive network he had established. In large part, his success may be attributed to the combination of smuggling goods across international borders, distribution on a local level, and a strong network of corrupt officials. Hatfield was able to develop an empire that made him one of the most powerful drug lords in the world because he was able to keep his operation going smoothly. As a result of his understanding of how to keep his business running smoothly, Despite the fact that Hatfield was not as well known for his use of violence as some other criminals, this did not mean that he was hesitant to resort to it when it was absolutely required. In point of fact, the fact that he was able to exert control over his empire through a combination of intimidation, manipulation, and covert violence made him an even more serious threat. The use of threats and intimidation was a common method that Hatfield employed to maintain tight control over his empire and ensure that his collaborators remained in line. In the event that someone disrespected him, or if a portion of his network was put in jeopardy, he made certain that the adverse effects were terrible. The importance of loyalty was something that Hatfield was well aware of in the world of drug trafficking, and every single person who betrayed him would be subject to harsh punishment. Over the course of time, his use of violence grew increasingly obvious. In the event that rival gangs or people entered his territory, they were met with severe punishment. There were a lot of enforcers available to Hatfield, both men and women, who were eager to carry out his commands without any hesitation. It was common practice for these enforcers to resort to violence in order to neutralize threats, so conveying a clear message to anyone concerned about crossing him. Despite the fact that Hatfield was not renowned for being very aggressive, one of the reasons his kingdom lasted for such a long time was because of his ability to keep power through terrifying his subjects. He was aware of when to withdraw from a situation and when to make someone an example of himself. The fact that he was able to conceal himself behind the scenes, in addition to his strategic use of violence, made him one of the most dangerous criminals that Australia has ever encountered. The illegal acts that Shayne Hatfield engaged in were not completely overlooked, despite the fact that he meticulously planned and methodically approached the process of developing his business. The scrutiny of law enforcement increased in tandem with the expansion of his network and the skyrocketing of his revenues. The Federal Police of Australia, AFP, and other agencies were fully aware of the rise of drug cartels in the country, and Hatfield was rapidly becoming a main target for the cartels. On the other hand, capturing a criminal such as Hatfield was not a simple task. For a number of years, the authorities had a difficult time gathering sufficient evidence to bring him to justice. Since Hatfield was able to conceal himself behind multiple layers of secrecy and conduct his business through middlemen, it was impossible for the authorities to establish a direct connection between him and the crimes. Moving his operations around the country and employing clever means to evade detection allowed him to stay one step ahead of the competition at all times. In an effort to avoid being discovered, it was common knowledge that he would frequently switch locations, make use of burner phones, and even keep up a false identity. One further thing that makes things more difficult is the fact that Hatfield's empire was constructed on a foundation of trust and devotion. In addition to surrounding himself with people who were able to keep their lips shut, He also established a network of informants who kept him apprised of any upcoming police raids or investigations. Because of this, he was extremely difficult to capture. In addition to this, he was willing to pay bribes to corrupt officials in order to guarantee that his shipments would pass through customs without any problems and that the authorities would be kept in the dark. It was a source of frustration for the Australian government. They were aware that they were going up against someone who was incredibly knowledgeable and competent, someone who had spent years honing his plans. Nevertheless, they were unrelenting. Over the course of time, they started to construct an intelligence network that gradually caused Hatfield's empire to come under attack. In the beginning, bits of the puzzle were revealed through the use of undercover officers, wiretaps, and surveillance activities. Those in charge of the investigation started following his activities more closely in an effort to find the flaw in his well-oiled machine. The Australian Federal Police, AFP, were successful in identifying key members of Hatfield's network and intercepting several big shipments of drugs after conducting a groundbreaking investigation. This provided them with the evidence they required to make arrests. And as a result, Hatfield progressively became more and more surrounded by walls. On the other hand, Hatfield himself remained evasive throughout the entire process of his associates being detained. Hatfield's level of paranoia increased in proportion to the progress made by the authorities in their pursuit of his inner group. The number of people he trusted decreased, and he became more wary. But the strain was increasing despite the fact that he was making every attempt to conceal himself. There was no way that law enforcement was going to allow him to escape. The culmination of Hatfield's empire was reached when law enforcement agencies carried out a series of coordinated raids across the entirety of Australia. Some of the most important people in Hatfield's inner circle had already been taken into custody by this point, and the majority of them were working with the authorities. His network was being infiltrated by agents operating undercover, and evidence was starting to accumulate. When it came to the decline of Hatfield's empire, it was only a matter of time until it commenced. There was a rapidity and accuracy to the raids. As a result of the information that was acquired from Hatfield's contacts, the authorities began to investigate his homes and safe houses. At this point, it was no longer enough to simply seize drugs. Rather, it was necessary to bring the entire operation to a halt. Multiple places connected to Hatfield were searched by law enforcement, and they found enormous quantities of methamphetamine, guns, and millions of dollars in cash hidden at those locations. In addition to this, they discovered extensive records of his transactions, which provided insight into the scope of his enterprise. However, despite the fact that the authorities were getting closer to his business, Hatfield continued to stay one step ahead of them. In the beginning, he was successful in evading capture by sneaking out of the country and going into hiding. It appeared as though Hatfield had vanished into thin air, despite the fact that the police had no concrete clues on his whereabouts and had made every effort to retrieve him. The authorities were able to obtain important intelligence as a result of the arrest of several high-ranking members of his cartel, including his loyal enforcers. This series of arrests was essential in the dismantling of a significant portion of his enterprise. At the same time that Hatfield was still on the run, his empire was falling apart from the inside out. In response to the fact that they were now facing prosecution, the remaining members of his cartel began to turn against one another, which further weakened the criminal network. The name Hatfield continued to inspire dread all around Australia, despite the enormous amount of pressure that was being applied. Even while he was hiding, he was still considered to be one of the most dangerous criminals in the country, and stories about his whereabouts flew like wildfire. There were others who claimed that he was concealing himself in plain sight, while others speculated that he might have gone to a different nation entirely. As of this moment, Shayne Hatfield is still considered to be one of the most sought fugitives in Australia. His whereabouts are still unknown, despite the fact that law enforcement has made numerous attempts to pinpoint his location. Despite the fact that the authorities in Australia are continuing their hunt, the criminal mastermind has proven to be extraordinarily difficult to locate. There is a school of thought that suggests Hatfield may have utilized his extensive network of contacts and resources in order to vanish altogether, possibly even acquiring a new name. Some individuals are of the opinion that he may have found sanctuary in a nation that has less extradition cooperation with Australia, which would make it more challenging for the authorities to apprehend him. There is no doubt about it. Hatfield's disappearance has not prevented the consequences of his conduct from occurring. The legacy of his drug empire continues to have an impact on Australia's efforts to combat the drug trade, despite the fact that his cartel has been effectively crushed. The rates of addiction that were induced by the methamphetamine that he distributed continue to have an impact on communities all over the country, and law enforcement is still dealing with the fallout of his operations. Shayne Hatfield is considered to be one of the most renowned criminals in Australia, and the mystery surrounding his demise only serves to add to his notoriety. It is a sobering reminder of the risks posed by the international drug trade, as well as the fact that even the most well-organized criminal businesses may eventually be brought down. His rise to power and subsequent fall from power serve as a warning of this. The story of Hatfield, however, is not yet finished. As long as he continues to evade capture, his name will continue to be associated with one of the most powerful and deadliest drug gangs that Australia has ever witnessed. Over the course of his ascension to the top of Australia's criminal underground, Shayne Hatfield left an indelible impact not only on the drug trade, but also on the lives of a great number of diverse individuals. As a result of his life being driven by power and greed, his name has become synonymous with ruthless ambition, criminal genius, and the disastrous consequences of such a life trajectory. The legacy of his acts continues to ripple across Australian society, despite the fact that his empire eventually fell apart. The story of Hatfield is more than just a tale of criminal triumph. It is also a cautionary tale about the steep price that must be paid in order to pursue wealth and influence through illicit means. When Hatfield was at the height of his authority, he was in charge of a complex network of drug traffickers, suppliers, and enforcers, all of whom had connections to worldwide cartels. Due to the fact that he was able to bring in enormous quantities of methamphetamine, he became one of the most feared and sought-after criminals in Australia. However, it was his ability to think strategically, manipulate people, and carefully plan that enabled him to prosper for such a long period of time in a field where many others would have been caught. Through his economic dealings as well as his personal connections, Hatfield was a master of control. He had the ability to instill a sense of trust and loyalty in his companions. But what was more significant was that he recognized the significance of terror. Sooner or later, even the most meticulously crafted criminal empire will start to manifest cracks. The fact that Hatfield was able to avoid being captured for such a long period of time was truly remarkable. Nevertheless, in the end, it was the sheer magnitude of his operation that ultimately led to his downfall. As more people were involved in his enterprise, there was an increase in the number of opportunities for him to make mistakes. It has become painfully obvious that Hatfield's illicit activities have caused a great deal of damage in the years that have passed since his downfall. The problem in Australia, caused by methamphetamine, which he helped create, is still wreaking havoc on communities all over the country. Despite the fact that the rates of addiction continue to be high, the social costs of meth use are astounding. Not only has the substance itself been responsible for the destruction of individual lives and families, but also the violence and criminal activity that frequently accompanies the drug trade has also played a role in this. Despite the fact that Hatfield may have been apprehended or fled into hiding, the harm that his empire produced is still being felt by those who were left behind. The story of Shayne Hatfield is one of being driven by ambition, being ruthless, and having a strong desire to exert authority. It is the tale of a man who, by virtue of his genius, charisma, and cruelty, established an empire that extended across multiple continents and altered the path of countless others' lives via his actions. His story serves as a reminder of the true cost of organized crime, which is not only measured in terms of monetary loss, but also in terms of the long-term damage it causes to society. It is possible that Hatfield's fate is still unknown. Nonetheless, the repercussions of his acts will be felt for many years to come. It is possible that his legacy will be one of caution. Regardless of how powerful or untouchable a criminal empire may appear to be, it is never beyond the reach of law.